The war has reduced the world to its most unforgiving elements, stripping landscapes and people alike of warmth, certainty, and mercy. Winter presses down with a physical weight, turning breath into a visible reminder of vulnerability. In this exposed terrain, a single man moves forward under guard, his body weakened by exhaustion and his mind hardened by expectation. Every sensation, the ache in his joints, the numbness in his fingers, the relentless wind cutting through inadequate clothing, confirms what he believes he already knows, that capture is not an end, but the beginning of something far worse. The cold is not merely a condition of the environment, it has seeped into his thoughts, shaping them into rigid assumptions about what lies ahead. For weeks, perhaps months, survival has depended on mistrust. The war has taught him that compassion is a liability and that enemies exist to destroy, not to restrain themselves. Stories circulate faster than facts in wartime, and he has absorbed them all, accounts of beatings, starvation, humiliation, and disappearance. These narratives have become armor, preparing him psychologically for cruelty he believes is inevitable. Now, as his strength falters and his options vanish, that armor feels thin, but it remains firmly in place. He anticipates pain with the same certainty he anticipates the next sunrise, assuming that suffering is simply the next phase of his journey. Exhaustion clouds his sense of time. Hours blur together, marked only by marching, waiting, and the constant struggle to remain upright. His body has learned to conserve energy, reducing movement to the bare minimum required to avoid collapse. Hunger gnaws at him with a steady persistence, but it is fear that dominates his inner world. Fear of the unknown, fear of deliberate cruelty, fear of being reduced to something less than human. In his mind, capture has already erased his identity, replacing it with a number, a problem, or an inconvenience to be dealt with harshly. The enemy, as he imagines them, is not composed of individuals but of a single, faceless force. Years of propaganda and battlefield experience have fused into a monolithic image of brutality. He does not expect to be seen or understood. He expects to be processed, punished, and possibly discarded. This belief provides a grim clarity. If cruelty is assured, then endurance becomes the only remaining form of resistance. He tells himself that he must be ready to absorb whatever comes, to show no weakness, to survive by sheer stubbornness if nothing else. The cold intensifies as daylight fades, and with it, his anticipation sharpens. Night, he assumes, will bring the worst. Darkness has always been when violence feels most unchecked, when screams carry less consequence and restraint is easier to abandon. He braces himself internally, rehearsing silence, rehearsing submission, rehearsing the mental distance required to endure pain without breaking. These preparations are not hopeful, they are practical, shaped by a war that has taught him to expect the lowest expression of power. In this mental state, even small details take on ominous significance. The sound of boots behind him, the clink of equipment, the brief pauses during movement, all are interpreted as preludes to punishment. He studies the ground more than the faces around him, avoiding eye contact not out of shame but out of instinct. To be seen, he believes, is to invite cruelty. To remain unnoticed is to delay it, if only briefly. His world narrows to immediate sensations and grim predictions. There is also, beneath the fear, a quiet sense of resignation. The war has taken too much already for him to imagine escaping unmarked. Loss has become a constant companion. Lost comrades, lost ideals, lost futures. Capture feels like the final confirmation that individual will no longer matters. He does not expect justice, fairness, or understanding. He expects the war to complete its work on him, to finish the process of reduction that began long before this moment. Yet even in this resignation, there is tension. The human mind resists finality, clinging to patterns and expectations as a way to maintain control. His anticipation of cruelty is, paradoxically, a form of certainty in an uncertain world. If the enemy is cruel, then the world still makes sense according to the rules he has learned. Violence confirms the narrative he has lived by, validating his fear and his hatred. In this way, he almost depends on cruelty to justify everything that has come before. As he waits, Cold and exhausted, he reflects not on ideology but on endurance. He thinks of the body as something separate from the self, something that can be pushed, ignored, sacrificed. Pain, he tells himself, is temporary, humiliation can be survived. What matters is not dignity, but persistence. This mindset has carried him through bombardment, retreat, and loss, and he assumes it will carry him through captivity as well. The expectation of cruelty becomes a challenge to be met rather than a question to be asked. The environment reinforces his beliefs. The war-torn landscape offers no comfort, no sign of mercy. Broken ground, damaged structures, and the absence of civilian life suggest a world abandoned by restraint. In such a setting, kindness feels implausible, almost naive. He interprets the silence around him as indifference rather than calm, as the quiet before deliberate harm rather than disciplined control. Everything he sees aligns with what he expects to experience next. In this moment, his fate appears sealed by forces far larger than himself. Nations, armies, and ideologies have collided, and he feels himself crushed beneath their weight. Personal morality seems irrelevant here, replaced by the blunt logic of victory and defeat. He assumes that his captors will act not as individuals with choices, but as instruments of a system that values domination over humanity. This assumption allows him to distance himself emotionally, preparing for dehumanization before it is imposed. The anticipation of cruelty becomes almost ritualistic. It structures his thoughts, organizes his fear, and gives him something concrete to prepare for. Without it, he would be forced to confront uncertainty, which feels more dangerous than pain. He tells himself that hope is reckless, that expectation of mercy is weakness. The war has taught him that disappointment is more damaging than despair, and so he chooses despair deliberately, believing it to be the safer option. As time stretches on, the cold deepens its hold, and exhaustion presses him closer to collapse. Yet he remains alert, watching, waiting, bracing. Every moment without violence feels temporary, an anomaly that must soon correct itself. He does not yet recognize this pause as meaningful. To him, it is merely the delay before cruelty asserts itself, restoring the brutal order he believes governs the world. This is where his story begins, not with violence itself, but with the certainty of it. Cold, exhausted, and captured, he stands at the threshold of an experience he believes will confirm everything he knows about war and humanity. His fate, as he understands it, is already written by fear, expectation, and the lessons of conflict. What he does not yet realize is that this certainty is about to be challenged, and that the absence of immediate cruelty will prove more destabilizing than its presence ever could. The moment of capture does not unfold with the violence he has rehearsed in his mind. There is no sudden explosion of rage, no gratuitous blow meant to establish dominance. Instead, the transition from freedom to captivity happens with an almost unsettling efficiency. Hands signal rather than strike. Voices issue instructions rather than threats. The absence of chaos feels wrong to him, as if the scene is missing a necessary element. He remains tense, muscles coiled in expectation, convinced that this calm is merely a prelude to something harsher. The British soldiers move with a practiced precision that suggests routine rather than passion. Their actions are firm but controlled, shaped by procedure rather than impulse. Weapons remain ready, yet they are not wielded theatrically. No one shouts insults or celebrates his capture. This lack of emotional display disturbs him more than overt cruelty would have. He scans their faces for signs of contempt or enjoyment and finds instead expressions that are neutral, even distant. To him, this restraint feels unnatural in the context of war, where hatred has so often been the fuel that drives action. He waits for the moment when the mask will drop. War has taught him that civility is often a fragile surface, easily shattered once power is secured. Each step he takes under guard, he assumes, brings him closer to the inevitable revelation of brutality. Yet the steps continue, and the restraint holds. Orders are repeated calmly when misunderstood. Pace is adjusted when his exhaustion becomes obvious, not out of sympathy, but out of practicality. He cannot decide whether this is a calculated tactic or something more deeply ingrained. Time begins to stretch in unfamiliar ways. Without immediate violence to anchor his fear, his thoughts start to drift. He notices details he would otherwise have ignored: the rhythm of boots on the ground, the way equipment is checked and rechecked, the quiet communication between soldiers who seem to know exactly what is expected of them. This is not the behavior of men seeking revenge. It is the behavior of men performing a task within defined limits. That realization unsettles him, because it introduces the idea that his suffering is not guaranteed. As they move, he becomes acutely aware of his own condition. His breath is shallow, his limbs heavy, his body betraying him with each step. He expects this weakness to invite punishment, to mark him as expendable. Instead, it is acknowledged only insofar as it affects progress. When he stumbles, he is steadied just enough to continue moving, not helped, but not struck either. The distinction is subtle, yet profound. It suggests indifference rather than malice, and indifference, in this context, feels almost merciful. The absence of cruelty forces him into a state of heightened alertness. He listens carefully to every word spoken around him, searching for hidden meaning or impending threat. Yet the language remains functional, stripped of excess emotion. Instructions are clear, focused on logistics rather than intimidation. This procedural tone clashes sharply with the stories he has carried with him, stories that framed capture as a descent into deliberate suffering. The discrepancy creates a quiet cognitive strain, a tension between what he expects and what he is experiencing. As daylight fades, he braces himself once more. Darkness, he believes, will remove whatever restraints still exist. Yet even as the environment grows colder and more hostile, the behavior of his captors remains unchanged. Guards rotate methodically. Perimeters are established without spectacle. He is positioned where he can be monitored, not isolated in a way that suggests imminent harm. The war has conditioned him to associate control with violence, and the lack of it here feels like an unresolved equation. This restraint begins to alter his internal posture. Fear does not vanish, but it changes shape. Instead of sharp, immediate terror, it becomes a dull, persistent unease. He is no longer bracing for a blow, he is waiting for an explanation. Why has he not been punished? Why has his capture been treated as an administrative act rather than a moral one? These questions trouble him because they undermine the simplicity of enemy narratives. If cruelty is not automatic, then the war is not as morally uniform as he has believed. He studies his captors more closely now, no longer avoiding their presence but observing them in fragments. He notices small signs of discipline: equipment maintained despite fatigue, routines followed despite the cold. These men appear bound by rules that extend beyond immediate necessity. Their restraint does not feel performative, it feels habitual. That realization is perhaps the most unsettling of all, because habits are harder to dismiss than exceptions. It suggests that restraint is not a temporary choice but a structural feature of how they operate. The passage of time without violence introduces a new vulnerability. Without suffering to occupy his mind, memories surface. He recalls moments earlier in the war when he himself operated under orders, when restraint was discussed but not always practiced. He remembers how easily boundaries could blur under pressure, how quickly justification could be found for acts that would have seemed unthinkable in another context. The comparison is uncomfortable. It forces him to confront not only the behavior of his captors, but his own past assumptions and actions. He becomes aware of a subtle shift in power. Violence, he has always believed, is the ultimate assertion of dominance. Yet here, power is expressed through control and limitation. His captors possess the ability to harm him, and it is precisely their choice not to do so that defines the situation. This restraint places him in a state of dependency that feels different from terror. He is not being broken, he is being contained. The difference is difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. Hunger and cold remain constant companions, reminders that this is still war, still captivity. The conditions are not kind, but they are not designed to humiliate. He is given what is necessary to remain functional, nothing more. This measured approach reinforces the sense that he is part of a system rather than the target of personal animosity. It deprives him of the emotional clarity that hatred provides. Without an obvious villain, his anger has nowhere to settle. As night deepens, he finds himself listening not for screams or blows, but for routine sounds. Footsteps, quiet exchanges, the occasional adjustment of gear. These sounds, mundane and repetitive, begin to replace fear with a strange sense of suspension. He exists in a space between expectation and reality, unable to reconcile the two. The war he understands has always been loud in its cruelty. This war, in this moment, is quiet in its restraint. The realization dawns slowly that this restraint is not accidental. It is maintained despite fatigue, despite cold, despite the opportunity to act otherwise. That persistence gives it weight. It suggests intention, perhaps even belief. He does not yet know what to make of this, but he senses that something fundamental is shifting within him. The certainty that once sustained him is eroding, replaced by ambiguity that feels dangerous in its own way. He wonders, briefly and almost unwillingly, what this restraint means beyond his own survival. If the enemy is capable of limiting itself, then the moral landscape of the war is more complex than he has allowed himself to see. This thought frightens him more than cruelty would have, because complexity demands reflection, and reflection threatens the narratives that have kept him focused and alive. By the time he is finally left to rest, guarded but unharmed, exhaustion overtakes him in a way that feels different from before. It is not the collapse that follows terror, but the fatigue that follows sustained tension without release. His body relaxes despite his mind's resistance, and in that moment, the absence of violence becomes undeniable. He has anticipated cruelty, prepared for it, built his inner defenses around it, and yet it has not arrived. This chapter of his captivity closes not with relief, but with disorientation. The British restraint has altered the rhythm of his fear, interrupting the expected progression from capture to suffering. He remains a prisoner, cold and exhausted, but the meaning of his situation has begun to shift. The enemy has not confirmed his worst expectations, and in doing so, has opened a crack in the moral certainty that once defined his world. Days pass, though at first he measures time less by dates than by routine. The structure of captivity reveals itself gradually, not through explanation but through repetition. Mornings begin the same way, marked by movement and brief checks. Evenings settle into guarded stillness, and the space between is filled with waiting. The conditions remain harsh, offering no comfort beyond what is necessary to keep him alive. Cold still seeps into his bones, hunger still tightens his stomach, and uncertainty still hangs over every moment. Yet beneath these hardships, a pattern emerges, and with it, a realization that this suffering is not designed to punish, but to contain. He begins to understand that he is part of an organized system, not the focus of personal hostility. The guards rotate regularly, each taking over with the same measured demeanor, as if following a script written long before he arrived. There is no escalation, no sudden change meant to test his endurance or provoke fear. Even mistakes are handled without drama, corrected rather than exploited. This consistency challenges him more deeply than cruelty would have, because it denies him the emotional clarity of victimhood. He is not being targeted, he is being managed. The predictability of his treatment slowly alters his internal state. Fear remains, but it no longer spikes with every sound or movement. Instead, it settles into a background presence, constant but muted. In its place grows a cautious awareness of boundaries. He begins to sense where the limits are, what will be tolerated, what will be corrected, and what will not happen at all. Violence, once expected at any moment, now feels oddly out of place within this environment. The absence of random brutality becomes a defining feature of his captivity. This realization forces him into an uncomfortable reassessment of power. He has always believed that power in war is proven through dominance expressed physically. Here, however, power is expressed through control and consistency. The guards do not need to assert themselves through pain. Their authority is unquestioned because it is systematic. He obeys not because he is terrified, but because the structure leaves little room for resistance. This dynamic unsettles him, as it undermines his long-held belief that fear is the primary tool of control. As he observes more closely, he notices how restraint extends beyond his own treatment. The guards interact with one another in ways that reflect discipline rather than aggression. Disagreements are resolved quietly, decisions are deferred to protocol, and personal emotions appear carefully contained. This suggests a culture shaped by rules that persist even under strain. He cannot help but compare this to moments earlier in the war when discipline on his own side had frayed, when exhaustion and anger had overridden restraint with devastating consequences. The comparison stirs memories he has tried to suppress. He recalls scenes of chaos, moments when the absence of boundaries led to irreversible harm. At the time, those actions had felt justified, even necessary, framed by the urgency of survival. Now, confronted with an opposing force that seems to maintain limits despite similar pressures, those justifications feel less secure. The memory of restraint, or the lack of it, begins to haunt him in new ways. Hunger sharpens his senses, and cold keeps him alert, but neither pushes him toward despair as he once expected. Instead, these hardships become part of the environment, obstacles rather than instruments of cruelty. He is given enough to endure, not enough to recover. This balance reinforces the impression that his captors are not interested in breaking him, only in preventing escape and maintaining order. The realization strips away the emotional intensity he once associated with captivity, replacing it with a quieter, more persistent unease. In this atmosphere, time stretches differently. Without constant fear or pain to mark its passage, days feel both longer and less distinct. He begins to think more, replaying not only recent events but the broader arc of his involvement in the war. Questions surface that he had previously avoided, about responsibility, about choice, about how easily lines were crossed when restraint was absent. These thoughts are not forced upon him. They arise naturally in the space created by the absence of immediate threat. He recognizes that restraint has become a mirror. By not inflicting cruelty, his captors have removed an external enemy against which he could define himself morally. Without that contrast, he is left alone with his own actions and beliefs. The war's simple divisions, us and them, right and wrong, begin to blur. He does not abandon his loyalties, but he can no longer sustain the illusion that morality is exclusive to one side. This internal shift is subtle but profound. He finds himself listening differently, watching differently, even moving differently. Compliance becomes less about fear and more about understanding the structure he exists within. He learns which actions draw attention and which pass unnoticed, not because he fears punishment, but because he recognizes the logic of the system. This adaptation feels unsettling, as if he is becoming complicit in his own containment. At moments, resentment flares. He resents the cold, the hunger, the loss of agency. He resents being reduced to a logistical problem. But these feelings lack a clear target. There is no single act of cruelty to anchor his anger, no individual whose malice he can blame. The restraint that governs his captivity diffuses responsibility, making it harder to sustain hatred. This emotional diffusion leaves him feeling exposed, deprived of the psychological defenses that anger once provided. He begins to understand that restraint can be a form of psychological pressure. By denying him the release of suffering, it forces him inward. The war outside may be loud and violent, but within captivity, the struggle becomes internal. He wrestles with questions he once dismissed as irrelevant. Would he have acted differently under different rules? Did the war require brutality, or did it merely permit it? These questions do not yield clear answers, but their presence marks a significant change. The guards remain largely impersonal, yet their consistency gives them a presence that feels almost institutional. They represent not individual will, but an idea of order that persists despite chaos. This challenges his belief that war inevitably dissolves all ethical boundaries. If restraint can survive here, in these conditions, then perhaps the war is not the only force shaping behavior. Perhaps choice still exists, even under extreme pressure. This possibility unsettles him deeply. Choice implies responsibility, and responsibility implies accountability. If his captors can choose restraint, What does that say about moments when restraint was absent on his own side? He does not yet articulate these thoughts fully, but they linger, reshaping his understanding of the past. The absence of cruelty in the present casts a long shadow backward, illuminating actions he once accepted without question. As days continue, the environment remains unchanged, reinforcing the permanence of this new reality. He is not rescued, not harmed, not forgotten. He exists in a controlled state, suspended between past and future. This suspension forces him to confront the moral weight of survival itself. Survival, he realizes, is not only about enduring physical hardship, but about living with the knowledge of what one has done and what one has witnessed. The restraint he experiences does not absolve the war of its horrors. He is acutely aware that suffering continues elsewhere, unseen and unmeasured. Yet within his limited world, restraint has become a defining force, shaping his perception of humanity under pressure. It reveals that even in systems designed for violence, limits can exist, and that those limits matter. By the end of this period, he understands that something fundamental has changed. He is still a prisoner, still cold and hungry, still uncertain about his fate. But the certainty that once governed his expectations has dissolved. The enemy is no longer a single, brutal abstraction. Instead, they appear as participants in a system that values control over cruelty. This realization does not bring comfort, but it brings complexity, and complexity, once introduced, cannot be undone. This chapter of his captivity marks a turning point not through dramatic events, but through sustained restraint. The absence of deliberate cruelty forces him to confront the moral ambiguity of war and his place within it. In this quiet, controlled environment, his understanding of power, responsibility, and humanity begins to shift, setting the stage for a deeper reckoning that will follow. The longer the restraint continues, the more its psychological weight becomes apparent. What once felt like an anomaly now reveals itself as a deliberate and sustained condition. There is no escalation, no moment where patience wears thin and violence breaks through. Instead, the boundaries remain firm, almost inflexible, and it is this consistency that begins to work on him in ways he had not anticipated. The war outside may be driven by destruction, but within this confined world, restraint has become the dominant force shaping his experience. Without overt cruelty to resist, his mind turns inward. The absence of constant threat removes the urgency that once governed his thoughts, creating space for reflection he never intended to allow. Memories surface uninvited, not just of battles and losses, but of quieter moments where decisions were made under pressure. He recalls times when restraint could have been exercised but was not, moments when anger, fear, or obedience filled the space where judgment should have been. These recollections do not arrive with clarity or resolution. They come fragmented, heavy with implication. The guards remain distant, yet their presence is steady and unavoidable. They do not provoke him, nor do they engage him beyond what is necessary. This emotional neutrality denies him the opportunity to define himself in opposition to them. He is not resisting cruelty, he is existing within a system that offers him no clear moral adversary. This forces a subtle but profound shift in how he understands his own role in the war. Without a visible enemy to absorb his resentment, he is left to confront the discomfort of ambiguity. Restraint begins to reveal itself as a form of discipline that extends beyond individual behavior. It is embedded in routines, enforced through repetition, and maintained even when conditions would seem to justify its abandonment. Cold, fatigue, and scarcity do not erode it. Instead, they coexist with it, suggesting that restraint is not dependent on comfort or optimism, but on adherence to principle. This realization unsettles him deeply, because it contradicts the belief that extreme circumstances inevitably excuse extreme actions. As days blend together, he notices changes within himself that are difficult to articulate. His posture shifts, not physically but mentally. He is no longer braced for impact at every moment. Vigilance remains, but it is quieter, more controlled. The constant readiness to endure pain gives way to a different kind of tension, the unease of being seen, measured, and left intact. He begins to understand that restraint can strip away defenses just as effectively as violence can. The moral simplicity that once sustained him starts to fracture. The war had demanded clarity, loyalty, obedience, survival. Questions of ethics were secondary, often dismissed as luxuries incompatible with reality. Now, confronted with an enemy who appears to operate within limits, those questions return with unexpected force. He cannot reconcile their restraint with the image he has carried for so long. The dissonance forces him to reconsider the narratives that once gave his actions meaning. He reflects on the idea of inevitability. For much of the war, he believed that certain outcomes were unavoidable, that violence followed naturally from conflict, and that individuals were merely conduits for larger forces. Restraint challenges this belief. It suggests that choices persist even when options are constrained, that behavior is not entirely dictated by circumstance. This implication is deeply unsettling, because it reintroduces the concept of responsibility into a space where he had learned to suppress it. The environment offers no comfort, yet it no longer feels hostile in the way he expected. The cold remains indifferent, the hunger persistent, but these hardships lack the personal malice he once feared. They feel like conditions rather than punishments. This distinction matters more than he anticipated. It changes how he interprets suffering itself. Pain inflicted deliberately carries a message. Pain endured as a condition carries none. The absence of intent forces him to confront suffering without the clarity of blame. At times, he finds himself almost wishing for cruelty, not out of masochism, but out of a desire for resolution. Violence would confirm his expectations, restore the moral order he understands. Restraint, by contrast, leaves him suspended in uncertainty. It denies him the satisfaction of being proven right. This denial becomes its own form of pressure, compelling him to engage with questions he would rather avoid. He begins to notice how restraint shapes behavior on both sides of captivity. His own actions become more deliberate, less reactive. He speaks less, moves with greater awareness, not because he fears reprisal, but because he understands the structure he exists within. The guards, in turn, remain consistent, their behavior reinforcing the boundaries that define this space. This mutual adjustment creates a strange equilibrium, one that feels both stable and fragile. The psychological impact of this equilibrium grows over time. He becomes aware that his identity as a combatant is fading, replaced by a more ambiguous role. He is no longer actively participating in the war, yet he is not removed from its moral consequences. This in-between state forces him to confront the gap between who he was and who he is becoming. Restraint does not allow him to cling to the identity of a victim or a hero. It leaves him exposed as a human being shaped by choices. He reflects on the broader implications of what he is experiencing. If restraint can exist here, under these conditions, then perhaps the war is not solely defined by its worst moments. This thought does not excuse the violence he has witnessed or participated in, but it complicates the narrative that once justified it. The idea that humanity can persist, even partially, within systems of destruction challenges his understanding of history and his place within it. This realization brings no comfort. Instead, it deepens his unease. Humanity implies accountability, and accountability implies judgment. He begins to sense that the war's true reckoning may not come from courts or victors, but from memory and conscience. Restraint, by preserving his life and his capacity for reflection, ensures that he cannot escape this reckoning. Survival itself becomes a burden rather than a victory. As the days continue, the silence of cruelty becomes louder. Each unbroken routine, each uninflicted punishment, reinforces the weight of restraint. It presses on him not as fear, but as awareness. He is forced to recognize that the enemy he prepared himself to face does not exist in the form he imagined. Instead, he confronts a more unsettling reality, that moral boundaries, once believed to be erased by war, can endure, and that their endurance demands reflection from those who cross them. He begins to understand that restraint has altered the trajectory of his captivity in ways he cannot yet fully grasp. It has not freed him, but it has changed the terms of his existence. The war no longer feels like a single, overwhelming force sweeping away individual will. Instead, it appears as a collection of choices made under pressure, some destructive, some restrained. This perspective does not absolve him of his past, but it reframes it. By the end of this period, he recognizes that the greatest transformation is internal. The expected narrative of suffering has been replaced by a quieter, more persistent moral tension. He is still cold, still hungry, still uncertain about his future. Yet the certainty that once anchored him has dissolved. In its place stands a growing awareness that restraint, more than cruelty, has the power to alter how a person understands war, responsibility, and themselves. Over time, the experience settles into him not as a single memory, but as a gradual reorientation of how he understands survival itself. Survival is no longer simply the act of enduring hunger, cold, and uncertainty. It becomes an interpretive process, a slow recalibration of meaning shaped by what has not happened as much as by what has. The absence of cruelty, sustained and deliberate, begins to redefine what it means to remain alive within the machinery of war. He realizes that survival is not neutral, it carries moral weight, shaped by the conditions under which it is achieved. He begins to understand that restraint has altered his fate not by removing danger, but by changing its character. He is still vulnerable, still subject to forces beyond his control, yet the nature of that vulnerability feels different. It is no longer the raw exposure of a body awaiting harm, but the quieter exposure of a mind forced to reckon with complexity. The war has not released him, but it has denied him the simplicity of hatred. This denial reshapes his inner world in ways that feel both clarifying and deeply unsettling. As his captivity continues, he becomes aware that this experience will not remain confined to these moments. It will travel with him, shaping how he interprets the past and how he imagines the future. The British restraint has created a reference point he cannot ignore, a moment where the expected trajectory of suffering was interrupted. This interruption lingers, complicating the narrative of inevitability that once governed his understanding of the war. He begins to see that fate is not always imposed through force, sometimes it is redirected through choice. This realization reframes his memories of earlier battles. Events he once viewed as unavoidable consequences of conflict now appear differently, not as fixed outcomes but as moments where alternatives may have existed, even if only briefly. He does not absolve himself or others of responsibility, nor does he indulge in fantasies of a gentler war. Instead, he recognizes that the presence of restraint here exposes the absence of it elsewhere. This contrast sharpens his awareness of moral agency, making it harder to hide behind necessity or obedience. The war's ideological certainties continue to erode. He no longer sees the conflict solely as a clash of irreconcilable forces, but as a landscape shaped by countless individual decisions made under pressure. Some of those decisions produce devastation, others, restraint. This understanding does not diminish the scale of destruction, but it reframes its origins. Violence is no longer an abstract inevitability. It becomes a series of choices, repeated often enough to feel natural, yet still subject to interruption. In this context, restraint takes on a new significance. It is no longer merely the absence of cruelty, but an active stance that requires effort, discipline, and acceptance of limits. He recognizes that it would be easier, in many ways, for his captors to abandon restraint, to allow anger or exhaustion to dictate their actions. That they do not suggest a commitment that extends beyond immediate utility. This commitment challenges his assumptions about what motivates behavior in war, forcing him to consider values he once dismissed as irrelevant. He begins to think about what will happen if he survives this period, if he returns to a world beyond captivity. The question is no longer limited to physical survival, but to what kind of person he will be afterward. The experience has already altered his internal compass, making it impossible to return to the moral simplicity he once relied upon. He senses that this change is irreversible. The restraint he has witnessed has embedded itself into his understanding of power and responsibility, shaping how he will interpret future events. At times, this awareness feels like a burden. Ignorance, he realizes, had been easier. Certainty had provided direction and justification. Now, he carries questions that offer no immediate answers. He wonders how he will explain this experience, whether to others or to himself. The narrative of cruelty interrupted by restraint does not fit neatly into the dominant stories of war. It resists simplification, demanding nuance in a world that often prefers absolutes. The conditions of captivity remain unforgiving, and he does not mistake restraint for kindness. Hunger still weakens him, cold still erodes his strength, and uncertainty still defines his days. Yet the distinction between suffering as punishment and suffering as condition continues to matter. It preserves a space within him where reflection can occur, where he is not reduced entirely to instinct. This space becomes the site of transformation, where the meaning of his survival is renegotiated. He begins to recognize that restraint has preserved more than his body. It has preserved his capacity for moral awareness. Had cruelty been inflicted, his focus would have narrowed to endurance alone, crowding out reflection. By withholding violence, his captors have inadvertently ensured that he remains mentally engaged, capable of questioning and remembering. This realization unsettles him, because it suggests that restraint can impose a different kind of obligation, one that extends beyond captivity. The idea of obligation begins to take shape. Survival under restraint, he senses, carries an implicit demand to remember accurately, to resist the temptation of simplifying the past into comforting myths.